I don't know which is more striking about the way this White House talks about terrorism. Is it the terrorist events they invent that never happened, or the ones that did happen that they pretend never existed? Here to help us explore that latter category is Salvatore Colleluori, who is I think it's Colleluori actually, who is the Associate Research Director for Media Matters and has been writing about the white nationalist movement. So first of all, Salvatore, thanks for coming on the program.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
And it's Colleluori. So sorry about that.
It is Colleluori, yes. It's okay. It's a tough one.
Yeah, I'm sure you've had worse. I've had worse too with my name. So listen, let's get right to it. There is the Trump White House has been hammering the press for not reporting tragedies, non-existent tragedies like the Bowling Green massacre. My favorite hashtag for that, by the way, was Je suis Bowling Green. But one of the things you guys at Media Matters have been talking about, and one of your associates wrote about, is the underreporting of right-wing terrorism. This is a big deal, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and I think one of the issues is that, there are actually more domestic terror attacks committed on U.S. soil by right-wing militants and terrorists, and generally domestic terrorism that is non-Islamic based happens significantly more than what is actually even reported, and so. That's why when Trump, put out that list that said that there was all these terrorist attacks that are being massively undercovered, it's true. But they are not, sort of the Islamic terrorist attacks that he likes to hype and try to stoke fear with. But they are terrorist attacks by either right-wing militiamen. There are people on the border who are sovereign citizens, people like that. And then obviously the white nationalism, KKK, and groups like that. That we have seen. Given, for example, the shooting in Charleston, South Carolina.
Right.
But especially with the way that the Trump did it, we actually put a piece on the site that talked about how in almost I think 6 or 7 of the cases that he mentioned in his these are the terrorist attacks that are undercovered, he actually gave television interviews to CNN, Fox, and MSNBC, speaking specifically on some of the attacks that he said got undercovered.
Yeah, and they were none of them were white nationalist or right wing attacks that he mentioned, right?
No, none of the attacks that he mentioned had anything to do with any of the right wing sort of groups that the SPLC has signified as either terrorist organizations or people associated with that kind of like violence and terror and that kind of stuff.
And one of the things that struck me is that you may know, I'm trying to bring it to mind now. I know that I think it was Sean Spicer and maybe somebody else. It came up a couple times where they talked about survivors of the incident in San Bernardino and at Fort Hood and at Atlanta, and they mentioned Atlanta a couple of times, but the Atlanta Police Department says they've never had an incident.
Yeah, specifically with regard to Spicer, I mean, he,
right.
Seems to have either made that up or was speaking of something else that no one's really clear about. I mean, we've been on the site monitoring Sean Spicer's lies. So far we have 6 or 7 clear lies that he has told. And in regards to Atlanta, what's so ironic about that was there was a terrorist attack in Atlanta during the 96 Olympic Games, as probably most people remember. And again, that had nothing to do with, people who are, jihadis or anybody like that. It was, again, a domestic terror incident.
And again, just to interrupt you, Salvatore, for a second. Yeah, just to interrupt for a second, not only was it nothing to do with the Middle East or jihadis, but it was a right-wing, Christian, white person bombing, I believe, abortion clinics or family planning clinics and other sites. I believe a gay nightclub as well, too, something like that?
Potentially, yeah. And, I mean, that's, I guess, the thing that, keeps getting lost here is that for, the the narrative that the right-wing media and specifically this White House is trying to portray is one that puts fear into people and tries to otherize Americans and otherize refugees. And I think as people have been juxtaposing online or on Twitter, there are more people who are killed each year by legal gun owners, excuse me, than by the numerous number of terrorists. So, there's a specific thing that's been done in right-wing media for years, which is this attempt to try and otherize. And that's why they're building so much on this now, because if and when a terrorist attack does happen, President Trump and right-wing media will immediately blame all of the people who have tried to let people into the country. So I think it's important for listeners, your listeners, and people who are media consumers to remember and to remind themselves that when people are trying to do this, when they're trying to otherize, when they're trying to say that Muslims are terrorists and things like that, that's not really based in reality. And then it's a distinct attempt to try and use propaganda to scare people for when something, inevitably will happen at some point in the future, whether that's here or elsewhere.
Right. No, I couldn't agree more. And again, we're talking with Salvatore Colleluori, who is Associate Research Director at Media Matters. I couldn't agree with you more, and that's extremely important. But I think in addition to that, I feel that people need to understand also that by, for example, taking the I believe it was called the Countering Domestic Terrorism Unit or the Countering Extremist Terrorism Unit, and refocusing it as the Countering Islamist Terrorism Unit, they're leaving out an entire category of people who oppose a threat to the lives and safety of American citizens. And so it's not only an ideological preparation for ideological war, it's also making us less safe, in my opinion. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And I think, one of the things that is important about, remembering that is that this really has been a concerted effort by right-wing media and by conservatives to try and downplay the sort of violence that comes from right-wing rhetoric. Even last year, speaking specifically of domestic terrorism and the kind of unit that is now being gutted or refocused or whatever you want to call it, right-wing media, specifically Fox News, for example, downplayed the Charleston shooter's racist motivations in going into a church and shooting people. And so, you look at every sort of facet, every time that there is a right-wing shooter, everything like that, the media attention and the media coverage is so small that, you would think that Muslims are committing massive, terrorism and crime, all over the United States, because when those incidents do happen, they get so much more attention than, right-wing folks who go in and shoot up mosques, or they go into churches, for example, or, obviously what we saw in Canada received a little bit of attention. But
well, although I have to say,
day,
just to jump in for a second, Salvatore, that it received more attention when it looked as if maybe one of the suspects had a Muslim name, when it turned out that that person was just a witness and that it was a lone shooter, white, alt-right nationalist. It seemed that it was then that the story kind of faded away.
Yep, and then it ebbed off, and that's a pattern that we've seen here at Media Matters before, where attention on and that's what's, I think, so not ironic, but was so disheartening about this list that the president put out, and right-wing media has been defending, is that these incidences, Brussels, Paris, San Bernardino, Pulse, they received so much attention. And that there are numerous terrorist attacks going on every day, and we would even potentially include swastikas being drawn on temples and things like that as forms of domestic terrorism. In a way, they're attempting to scare people. That doesn't get any coverage whatsoever, and I think that. That is what's really, disheartening and sad about this list, is it clearly was hastily put together. One of the examples that we actually pointed out was there was a shooting at a anti-Islamic rally where participants were supposed to draw a representation of the Prophet Muhammad, and this happened in Texas. And not only did Trump comment on that shooting and talk about, what was going on, but he actually blamed the people who hosted the event in the first case, which was Pam Geller and a couple of the folks over at her anti-Islamic organization, for instigating people into doing this in the first place. So, I mean, the kind of hubris that comes with saying, well, this is a list of all these terrorist attacks that no one has covered, and have all these right-wing media outlets be like, yep, that's right, these have never been covered. I think just shows a lot about the way that the right wing is going to coalesce around a lot of the lies that the Trump administration is putting forth, and that it is more imperative for real media, for the CNNs, the MSNBCs, the sort of larger media outlets out there, and even smaller progressive ones, to make sure that people are reading true facts in the news, instead of kind of partaking in the propaganda that is being pushed out by the White House and its cronies in the media.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in the couple minutes we have left, I also wanted to ask you about a piece you wrote, Salvatore Colleluori, called White Nationalists and Nativists Want Americans to Pay to Keep America White. And you pointed out, among other things, that Chris Kobach, who is a Trump advisor with nativist ties, helped write some of these executive orders. What should people know about that?
Yes, I actually wrote this piece that was focusing a lot on the way that the nativist organizations and the white nationalist movement have kind of rejoindered to go against sort of some of the progressive victories that we've seen when it comes to immigrants' rights over the last couple of years. These groups, these nativist groups and these white nationalist groups, actually were born out of the same place of a xenophobia and a hatred for others. And over the last couple of years have started to separate a little bit. The ties were always there, but I think these nationalist groups like the Federation for American Immigration Reform and the Center for Immigration Studies, and then their kind of surrogates like Jeff Sessions and Chris Kobach, they have sort of tried to become more mainstream so that they'd look less radical. However, now that the Trump administration is in there, they've sort of taken the blanket off essentially and decided to come together and embrace sort of the white nationalism that they were founded on. So we pointed out in there that CIS, Center for Immigration Studies, was actually putting out propaganda from the Daily Stormer, which is a rabidly white nationalist website, that they're promoting people on another white nationalist website called VDare, and so what they're attempting to do is sort of play up this idea that America is so unsafe that they need a border wall, that they need to kick people who look different out, that we need to deport the 11.5 million immigrants or 12 million immigrants who are undocumented, who currently reside in the country. And they want American people to pay for it. And if you look at poll after poll after poll, that has gone on for decades. People, support a pathway to citizenship. People support giving legal status to people who are already undocumented and who are living in the United States. So they're trying to make taxpayers pay for something that almost overwhelmingly they do not support. And they're doing it under the guise of national security, but in reality, it's because of a really deep strain of white nationalism and racism.
Which they are very aggressively, I would argue, from the White House on down, trying to normalize at this point, to try to make it okay to say things that haven't been and shouldn't be acceptable in a democratic and open society. Well, this is all very important stuff.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartily. And
Go ahead.
Yeah, and just sure. to counter that, I mean, by Bannon, the head of a alt-right white nationalist pushing essentially a website going into the White House, that normalization happened really quickly. And what you're seeing right now in right-wing media and kind of in some of these spaces where people were quiet about their racism or whatever, they've now decided that this is their opportunity to say what they truly believed and push forth the ideas that they've always sort of harbored, but felt like it wasn't appropriate to say. And so I think that from this, as progressives, we can almost in a way learn that the kind of feelings that racism were leaving, or that we were making significant victories, was only just being quieted. It wasn't necessarily being won. And I think that that's a really good reminder for us that, the progressive moves that we champion, the things that we care about, those could be easily fleeting. And, when you have people in the media who are specifically set up in an attempt to try and make sure that those voices are brought into the mainstream, like by Fox News or by now Breitbart, Daily Caller, some of these websites, that's something that we need to be focused on. And it's not normal that someone like Richard Spencer has the notoriety that he does, that some of these folks who are pushing these xenophobic and anti-immigrant sentiments are having the platform that they've been given since the election. So it's just a good reminder. And as we say here at Media Matters, is the sort of like far reaches of the right. We always have been monitoring. We've always been had our eye on, but it's scary now to see them in mainstream media, to see them in national media, to see them getting a press and attention in sometimes positive ways.
Yeah, and it's scary to see the President of the United States speaking up for someone like Milo Y, who couldn't speak at Berkeley, who's someone has a long history of hate speech. The idea that the president is using the prestige of that office to defend people like that is equally frightening. So, as you say, we're all going to have to fight back as voices for sanity and reason. And I still believe the majority of the American people are just and fair on these issues. We just have to speak for them and educate everyone on it. So, Salvatore Colleluori, Associate Research Director for Media Matters, thanks for writing about this, and thanks for coming on the program.